Do we have an intangible self that's somehow separate from our body? What are the assumptions that have come to underpin our modern understanding of psychology? And is the soul just a relic of the past? Matthew, if you could start by introducing yourself for the viewers.
Yes, my name is Matthew Nini. I am a research associate at the Institute of Philosophy in Zagreb, Croatia. I teach and research in philosophy, particularly the history of philosophy in Germany in the 19th and 20th century.
Well, you're perfectly placed then to answer the question of what it was that, in the history of theory of mind, what Kant brought to the table, what was new in his conception of the self. How did he see the self?
To understand Kant, I suppose we could go back to René Descartes and to a famous phrase with which most of us are familiar: I think, therefore I am. So Descartes was looking for something absolutely certain on which he could base knowledge of the world. Imagine that all of this was only imagined. Now, what could we know for certain in such a scenario? Well, Descartes thought that we know that we are indeed the person who is thinking when we are thinking. And this is something that is the bedrock of thought for René Descartes. And from there, he can build a whole edifice of thought going from certainty to certainty from this very simple remark, I am. Now, Kant, of course, is very familiar with that tradition, but he has a problem with it. It's too abstract for him. And so he discovers in the course of his education empiricists, often from England, from the United Kingdom today, David Hume in Scotland and others, and he finds that this awakens him from his dogmatic slumber, as he writes, a beautiful line. Now, how does Kant bring together these two traditions of Cartesian certainty that I am indeed the person who is thinking when I am thinking on the one hand, and that the material world is somehow what is most true on the other? So the Cartesian rationalist version of the world and the British empiricist version of the world. Instead of just assuming that the world is there and we perceive it and we're somehow watching it go by, Kant thinks that it is the world that has to adapt to the structures of the individual human mind, of the human subject. Now, what does this mean? This involves introducing into the way that human beings think two different aspects. One is passive and one is active. One is based on the outer world and one is processing it on the inside. The first is sensibility. So Kant will say that we have a passive sensing function. We see, we hear, we have five senses, and the world presents itself to us, and we take all of this information into our minds. We then process it through cognition, through what he calls the understanding. The faculty of understanding, it consists of the famous categories that he speaks about. What is essential is to know that for Kant there is a sort of apparatus in us that is made to process the world and make it intelligible. Now, Kant, of course, has these two aspects that are working together, and they come together in the perception and the comprehension of an object in the world. Very simply, when I look at the glass of water on the table, when I look at the papers in your lap, when I look at the books behind you, what I am doing for Kant, even if it seems to happen in an instant, is a very complex operation of passive reception and then critical understanding of digesting, as it were, the outside world.
And these two aspects, as it were, the sensory input and the rational mind, is the former, as it were, embodied and the latter abstract in the kind of Cartesian sense? Or is he trying to create a sort of fusion?
That's a very good question. We see that what he's trying to add to Descartes is something embodied. Famously, the problem with Descartes, as Gilbert Ryle, a British philosopher, once said, is the problem of the ghost in the machine. Well, how is it that I am this thinking person who is doing the thinking of which I am certain? How does this square with my day-to-day life, with my own body? And of course, Descartes has this very eccentric idea of a certain gland in the back of the head, the brain, called the pineal gland, that is supposed to be the place where mind and body meet. Now, Kant, of course, is completely dissatisfied with this and finds this is a very silly way of talking about these two things. And so the whole idea of Kantian thought is supposed to be about the bringing together of these two factors in a harmonious way. Now, does he really succeed? That's the question that will occupy the next century of philosophy in Germany afterwards. The objection is best put by someone named Salomon Maimon, who's sort of a wandering Jewish philosopher-theologian who arrives in Königsberg with a great pile of notes and says, "Mr. Kant, how lovely, but could you please tell me how these two things are supposed to interact? In other words, how do sense and understanding, how do perceptions and thoughts really come together? There's no place in the Kantian theory where they're supposed to really be processed and be brought together." Now, there perhaps is one, but Kant doesn't really like it.
What's that?
The imagination. Now, in the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant says, well, you know, there must be some faculty of the human mind that brings together material sensation and abstract understanding and is present at every level going all the way through. And this would be the human capacity to imagine things other than they are or that don't exist at all. Now, in the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, he limits this capacity of imagination to what he calls reproductive imagination. Today, we would say that that's the imagining of counterfactuals. I see this glass of water on your table, and I could imagine that it could be on my table because I've seen a glass of water, and I can conceive of it being otherwise than it is. Now, that's very limited. Why does he limit this? Because Kant does not want to open the door to anything dangerous, to any kind of esotericism. The Kantian revolution is all about using the sensible world, the world of material objects, as a sort of playground for the capacities of the mind. However, on the other hand, he needs this capacity of imagination in order for there to be some sort of unity between thought and matter, sense and understanding.
Did this kind of gap, this lacuna he, couldn't quite cope with, was that something that sort of bugged him? I mean, he obviously, as you say, he didn't want to go too far because it opened the door to something that he didn't like the idea of. I mean, do you think he managed that lacuna to his own satisfaction?
I think the best way that we could evoke this would be through a very peculiar phrase in the Critique of Pure Reason, where Kant says, "I think must be able to accompany all of my representations." What does he mean by this? This is a very strange phrase. Now, he is trying to guarantee a sort of unity of the self. Now, the problem, of course, when he introduces material and sensibility into thinking is the disparate nature of matter and the fact that matter and experience is spread out over time and space. And one could ask Kant the question, well, how do you know that you are indeed you in this moment and in the next moment? How can we reconcile the self through all of its many experiences? Now, Kant will come up with this idea of the I think as a sort of foundation for all of this. But of course, what one thinks is only related to things as they appear to me. And so one could introduce into the Kantian world the old Cartesian objection of, well, what if all of this is just illusion? And of course, because the Kantian system is operating on several levels, this would introduce several problems and not only one problem. It would introduce not only the problem of the reliability of the external world, but the unity and the reliability of the self and its perceptions. So the bulwark that Kant introduces famously to safeguard the reality of all things is a distinction between phenomenon, things as they appear to me, and noumenon, things as they are in themselves. Now, of course, time and space has to do with sense perception. And so, if you want to talk about things as they really are, then you have to talk about not things in themselves, but a thing in itself, since this would precede number linked to perception. Now, this will create quite a few problems for Kant, and it is perhaps best put by one of his contemporaries, Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, who says, without the thing in itself, I cannot enter into the Kantian system. With the thing in itself, I cannot stay there. Why can he not stay there? Well, it's because, first of all, on Kantian grounds, there is absolutely no legitimacy in talking about this thing. There is no knowledge about it. All that Kant could say is the bare fact that there is something, and even that may not be legitimate. We already spoke about the difference between understanding in me and the perception of things, and how these are to be reconciled, and how imagination might bring these together. If we talk about the thing in itself, and things as they appear to me, we have another problem that is perhaps even greater, because we then have to ask how it is that the perception of things relates to things as they actually are. If a thing in itself was the cause of our perception of something, then we would enter into a determinist system, and all of the problems that come with Descartes and his predecessors would be reintroduced, and the Kantian enterprise would have completely failed. This is the whole point of Kant speaking of the I on the self on several levels, several dimensions, because guess what? I am for myself, in a way, a noumenal thing, a thing in itself. I cannot perceive myself the way that I perceive an object in the world. This is what Kant calls the problem of self-affection, and he considers it to be a very, very grave problem. Kant is, in a way, is a formalist. There's a little box for things in themselves, and there's a little box for our perception, and never can we unbox them and bring them into collaboration, because he's not thinking about movement, activity, experience in a dynamic way. But, for example, in the Romantic conception of aesthetic experience, the complex experience of seeing something or hearing something beautiful brings all of these elements together of me remaining in myself and being aware of my feelings, but also moving beyond myself into something almost transcendent. And this is their solution to the Kantian problem of the thing in itself.
I mean, is it fair to say that he was trying to produce something that synthesized or reconciled an empiricist tradition and an extreme Cartesian rationalist position, but that he ends up with something that's still kind of divided?
Very true. And the history of German philosophy after Kant, what we could sort of call the Kantian aftermath, is in many different ways an attempt at achieving wholeness. So on the side of the German idealists, if we think of the German philosophers who are system builders, scientific thinkers that come after Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, they will say, their battle cry, very well articulated by Hegel, is that the truth is the whole. They're looking for the whole, all these disparate elements of the Kantian system, Kantian faculties, and then on a different level, the fact that Kant puts what we've talked about, which is theories of knowing, in a different category from moral philosophy, in a different category from aesthetics. He doesn't know how to bring all of these elements of his thinking together. The idealists want a whole from which they can think. The Romantics, who are different but overlapping thinkers, overlapping in time and in interest, will also do the same. They want poetry and philosophy to be brought together. They want to romanticize the world. Philosophy should be poetic. Poetry should be philosophical. The whole world should be seen through an aesthetic perception. And through the harmony of beauty, we will find a bringing together of all of these elements.
Now, is it true to say that the Romantics do conceptualize a sort of fresh idea of the self or the human subject?
What they're trying to do is they're trying to reintegrate in a new and intellectually rigorous way the elements of human experience that Kant and his generation wanted to discard. We could put it this way. Philosophy for the ancient Greeks and for people up until Descartes and Pascal and Leibniz, the great figures of early modernity and the Renaissance, philosophy was everything. Descartes is a mathematician. Descartes is a thinker of many things. One could have been a physicist and call oneself a philosopher, a biologist, a historian. It was all philosophy. And Kant and his contemporaries want something more rigorous. And in the wake of this, we have the Enlightenment movement, which has given us many good things that comes from the emancipation of particular sciences. Physics will say, no, I am not philosophy. I have my own methods. Biology will do the same. History will eventually do the same. And eventually one asks, well, what is left of philosophy? The Romantics will want to bring everything back in, but in a new personal way. They'll ask, well, we may have understood the mechanisms of the world, but do we understand it as human beings who feel as well as think? And so they look at the Kantian apparatus and they find something that they describe as being empty. This is the word that comes up very often with the idealists and the Romantics in describing the Kantian system that we've just described, as sort of this empty machine that's devoid of any feeling or anything really human. And so what does this machine have to become? How does this divided self we've seen in Kant have to be transformed in order to conform to this whole? Well, there would have to be something human that is not known to me, that is somehow underneath, that is this well of intuition and feeling.
And that's where the unconscious comes in, I guess.
Indeed.
And so tell me about how Schelling arrived at that and how he framed his understanding of the human subject. Is it something that anticipates Freud's ideas about the unconscious, or are we looking at something slightly different?
Now, that's a lovely question, because Freud himself would have hated it. He is confident that what he is doing is real, proper empirical science, and that Schelling and the philosophers had no business meddling in looking into the unconscious, and that they could only get so far because they were too bound up with vague emotion and such things. At the beginning of his career, in a lecture called On the Origins of Hysteria, Freud will say, look, I found the source of all psychopathology. All of your problems come from trauma that have been repressed, that you've pushed down into the unconscious mind. I'm very aware that this is something that philosophers have said before me, but they have no tools to get any farther on. Now, I think that's quite wrong. There's a sense in which Schelling and the philosophical predecessors are much more convincing in their account of the unconscious. But of course, in order to do this, we have to go back to Schelling himself. Like all the Romantics and idealists of his age, Schelling is interested in the idea of finding a whole. So why we have to find truth as a whole, the human being as a whole. And so there's sort of a macrocosm, microcosm in all of Schelling's philosophy, where the world and God and nature represent a sort of whole, and then the human being is a sort of representation of all of nature and even the mind of God in miniature.
So he's trying to get rid of the self-other divide.
Or rather integrate it into a sort of whole, such that the parts that exist in it work with each other harmoniously in order to produce something. This is sort of the romantic intuition of what happens in aesthetic experience. When I have an experience of beauty, all of the pieces just sort of fit together in their proper ordered way. It's teleological or order-based conception of the universe. Now, Schelling will see in the divide between nature and spirit, or we could perhaps say God and world, a sort of basic duality that's at work. And this goes back to Descartes, of course. Descartes, who thinks that there's a material world and then there is a mental world. And Schelling's way of reconciling this problem that he sees in Descartes and in Kant is to say that these are parts that belong to a whole, and in their activity, they relate to each other in a dialogical way, almost like two people speaking to each other the way we're doing now. One person is asking the question, and one person is giving the answer.
One sort of lead us forward to Hegel.
Indeed. So there's although he will want to distinguish himself from Hegel, where with Hegel there's sort of a resolution of all of these tensions through a dialectic, where there's a question, an answer, a response, and then from there we find a new question and we move on to something else. Whereas Schelling will use what I think is a beautiful poetic example. He goes back to Socrates. Plato's Socrates. In the Platonic dialogues, we see Socrates trying to discern what is true and what is not through conversation. Socrates will say to his interlocutors, you know, I have a conversation going on within me. There is a person in me, there is another in me who is somehow a stranger to me, who tells me when I've gotten something wrong. This is one of the reasons why Socrates accepts to take the hemlock and commit suicide at the instigation of the Athenian state. You know, he was put on trial for corrupting the youth, for putting all sorts of strange ideas in their heads. And he accepts this and willingly goes to his death because his daimon, his inner interlocutor, the deep voice, the sort of the voice of conscience, a modern person might want to say, does not forbid it. And so this conversation, this silent inner conversation between part of me that knows but does not ask, and another part that asks that does not know, this is Kant's duality being brought to life. Now, with the idea of the daimon, we have this sort of question almost of repression, but in a different way, in the sense that for Schelling thinks that we are beings moving towards a goal, and the goal is wholeness. You know, the truth is the whole. We're moving towards this conception of oneness and being at one with myself. Well, of course, you can't be at one with yourself if you weren't at some point something other than one with yourself. You know, this implies that there's a sort of tension or duality in the human soul that needs to be resolved. And so there is, we could say, a sort of dissociation in the Schellingian conception of the human soul that is parallel to Freud's repression and dissociation. So what does Freud say about dissociation? You have repressed a part of yourself from which you have become dissociated. Part of you is speaking, but you will not hear. Schelling might say, that's not necessarily bad. Rather, it could be the catalyst to growth.
Does Schelling think, as it were, you can get there, that it's possible for these dissociated minds to form a whole? Or is it that the human spirit, as he conceives it, is perpetually going to be in a condition of not quite integrating?
Schelling's philosophy could be summed up by the desire for nature to reach its culmination in spirit. This doesn't mean the material world disappearing or that plants become sort of angelic things. You know, he's not a strange esotericist, but he thinks that the absolute culmination of things is a sort of return to God. And again, this is a theme that one sees in Romantic poetry, the famous poem by Wordsworth about we return to God, who is our home. And there's something of this in Schelling, the sort of divine culmination of nature in a wholeness where matter and spirit, where knowing and feeling, truth and beauty, all become a harmonious totality. And so one might say that if one wanted to do psychiatry with Schelling, he's not a psychiatrist, and if you have any grave melancholic symptoms, I would suggest that you find a psychotherapist rather than reading Schelling, although one doesn't exclude the other. Schelling might think that rather in the same way that certain animals, shellfish, that outgrow their shells and shed them and then have to grow a new one, or in the way in which a caterpillar moves through an unpleasant experience of becoming sort of a chrysalis and then emerging as a butterfly. These are all very old images of nature's becoming, nature's evolution. Through this, one could see a sort of inner tension that is the catalyst for intellectual, spiritual development.
Somebody we've mentioned only briefly is Schopenhauer. What influence did he have in all this? What's his...
Schopenhauer, unlike Schelling, does not see a God who is moving from nature towards spirit and the reunification of the whole into something beautiful. Rather, he sees a Wille, welling up in us, animal desire that is constantly thirsting, but is never satisfied with anything, and from which there is no escape. This will is driving us onward. This is what the I, the self, is manifesting. So we are sort of the puppets of this will. So one could put it this way. Schopenhauer has taken these two conceptions of the I, a sort of broader one that is representations, all of my sensibilities, a sort of jumble of things that I'm dealing with, or in the Schellingian sensibility, a great vast unconscious force, and he universalizes it. Schopenhauer thinks that the only way we can escape from this terrible drive of the will is through escape either into the contemplative life of a monk or a hermit or someone living alone in the middle of the woods, or that of an artist who finds a sort of consolation in the creation of beautiful things that is a brief escape from this terrible world.
Where does all that pessimism come from? Because we've, as you say, we started this conversation talking about Kant and a kind of quite a sort of optimistic attempt to make a synthesis of these philosophical traditions. Where do we suddenly find ourselves with Schopenhauer and Nietzsche?
One could trace all of this back to Schopenhauer's experience of trying to think philosophically in a world where nature is no longer magical, where machines are more powerful than men, where things do not have any intrinsic meaning anymore. In a way, the Romantics brought this upon themselves. If Schopenhauer is a kind of disgruntled Romantic, it's in the sense that Novalis, one of the great, beautiful Romantic German poets who died at the age of 28, who saw the world through a sort of romantic prism that made everything beautiful, mythological, says, "Everywhere I seek the absolute, but I find only things." And it's this great disappointment that one only finds the material, the sensible, the banal, when really what one is looking for is the divine, the beautiful, the ecstatic. And this constant thirst is what is sort of theorized by Schopenhauer when he says, well, we've really set ourselves up for disappointment, and such is the lot of humanity.
How does Nietzsche fit into this?
Nietzsche, who is an enormous influence on Freud and his contemporaries, but who is also hidden in occasional footnotes and not brought out, thinks that there is some being that wells up in us that is not us, following this Freudian model, but that is not necessarily benevolent. And this is the origin of the Freudian id. Freud will get what he calls the S, the it, which we've translated as id, to kind of give it a special word in English. Freud gets it from someone in Grodek, and Grodek gets it from Nietzsche. And the question is, I go through life with desires that well up, material, animal desires in me. I am sort of the rider on a horse. I think I'm rational and reasonable and going through life with aims, but every now and again the wild horse will kick up. This is Nietzsche's point, to say to the philosophical predecessors, all well and good that we have these deep desires, but they're not necessarily going anywhere very pleasant.
It sets the stage for the next bit. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.